guys, welcome to Driving to the Hoops Basketball Diaries. Just wanted to start out by saying thanks for checking out my video, and please don't forget to subscribe today and like the video. So I'm going to be talking about all-time decade teams. So if you had a starting five from each decade, I'm going to go all the way back to the 50s and really try to kick this off. I'm going to go through probably the 90s and then we'll roll from there. Today we're just going to focus on the 50s though. So going back to the 50s, you know, there's not a lot of great footage, but you can still see a lot of the statistics and things like that. And a lot of guys were putting up great numbers back then. And in the 50s, you know, the Lakers were kind of the team, and they were in Minneapolis at the time. There was a couple other good teams. Even the Rochester Royals won one back then. So I just wanted to start out, I guess, with maybe the point guard position. I think this one's probably the biggest no-brainer, and that would be Bob Cousy, the Houdini of the hardwood. I've talked about him before as one of the great point guards of all time. He was really the first great, well-known guard, period. I mean, he was just so innovative in how he played. Handled the ball pretty well, especially for that time. I mean, could he play in today's game? If you time warped him from 1955, he probably wouldn't even make it on a Division I team, just be honest. But back then, the game was still pretty young, and a lot of guys dribbled kind of out in front of themselves, and you know, they didn't have the crossovers and things like that. But some of the things that he was innovative with was his passing. If you go back and you watch some of his passing, even by today's standards, he could dominate a game and really impress you with some of his highlights. Now, there's not a ton of them out there because he retired in 1963, I believe. He played about 13 seasons. I think he won at least one MVP, maybe two. I'd have to double check that, and I'll post it on the video. But just a great player, good scorer too. He could give you well into double digits, kind of an 18 and 8 assists kind of guy, 18 points, 8 assists. You know, just a winner, won several championships with the Celtics, and was just, like I said, such an innovative player. And then the number 2 spot, the shooting guard, this one was kind of tough to come up with. There was a couple of good shooting guards, but the one that comes to mind that really stood out was also a Celtic. His name was Bill Sharman. He was a good scorer, kind of Sam Jones before Sam Jones. Good shooter, didn't make a lot of mistakes, and his big thing actually was he was a great free throw shooter. Again, a guy that you're not going to find a lot of highlights on, but he was a winner and he could shoot the ball well, and that's what shooting guards did back then. Kind of had set shots and things like that. So there's not a whole lot of information on him. He didn't win an MVP or anything like that. The next guy, he was really the late 40s, but he also played in the 50s, and he would have been a very undersized forward by today's standards, but his name was Joe Fulks, F-U-L-K-S, Jumpin' Joe Fulks. He was the first player to score over 1,000 points in a season. He could really fill it up, and he jumped when he shot the ball, which was like unheard of. That'd be like doing a cartwheel while you're shooting now. Back then it was set shots and feet hardly left the ground, that kind of thing. Nice little jumper. And he could fill it up. He'd give you up 25, 30 points a game. Not a great rebounder or passer or anything else, but just one of the first elite scorers, if not the first elite scorer of it was the NBA, NBL, and the BAA. They were kind of all in the late 40s, like 1946, 47, when the league was kind of sprouting out of the ground, and then it landed in the NBA, the National Basketball Association. I should have looked this up because it's not household knowledge, but I can't remember the team Joe Fulks played for, but I can post it in here through the video. Again, a great scorer, 25, 30 a game, first guy to score 1,000 in a season. He could fill it up. The next guy, actually the next two guys, but the next guy was probably the first or second best player of the entire decade, and and he was, by the time he retired, he was the all-time league's scoring leader, and kind of the first prototype power forward, and had a nice jump shot from 15 feet, could knock that down from the elbow there. Was good at for about 2 dribbles. That was about it. He could give you a pump fake and get around you. He had a good first step. His name was Bob Pettit. Now there's a couple of highlights on him, and he played into the 60s. I think he retired in 63, 64, something, maybe 65. So you could even say he might have been the best power forward of the 60s also. Great rebounder, great scorer, just that first dominant power forward. He played with the Hawks, I believe, his entire career, winning 1 championship, I believe in 1958, with the St. Louis Hawks at the time. Of course, they later moved to Atlanta. But check him out. I'm sure he won an MVP or 2. 50s being kind of one of my weak eras that I don't know as much about, because it's just not stuff that's talked about as much anymore. But it's easy to find, and I'll definitely post it as we go. And then lastly, if it wasn't Bob Pettit as the best player of the 50s, it was this guy, and he was kind of the first. He was a little before Pettit in regards of his coming into the league. He played from the late 40s all the way into the mid 50s, and so by the time he retired, he had won several championships with the Lakers, and his name was George Mikan. He was the first great big man of the NBA. He was dominant. He was a 30 and 15 kind of guy. One of those players, you watch him now, he would be good. Maybe he would be good at like the college level, but he wouldn't be even great then. But back in the 50s, due to the infancy of the league and how the sport was still pretty young at that point, he was super dominant based on his size. He was about 6'10", probably 240, and he could just dominate guys. He could dunk. Bob Pettit could dunk too, and I'm sure Joe Fulks could dunk it as well. But George Mikan was the guy that he would dunk the ball. He had these goofy kind of glasses. He looked like Clark Kent from the old Superman show from the 50s, the black and white version. He just kind of had this big square head with glasses, and just kind of that prototypical, like the YMC kind of guy, rolling in there and dominating. So played with the Lakers. He actually retired, I believe, in 54, and then came back in the 1955-56 season. He didn't do that great. I don't think they won the championship because he took a year off. And then it's funny because the next season was the year that the great Bill Russell showed up. So their careers almost overlapped, but by 1 season they missed each other. So would have been interesting to see them play each other, even though Mikan was way past his prime by that point. But anyway, I like to see different generations kind of overlap like that and see how they do. So that's the great starting 5 probably of that era. Due to some racial issues back then, if you notice, all 5 of those players were white guys, and so that was just the way it was back then. And not to touch on political stuff, but in the later 50s, that's when a lot more African American players came along, and a lot more diverse going into the 60s and 70s as well. So I'm going to touch on the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s as we go along here, and I'll do that next week. And it's a pleasure talking with you. And if you guys could leave some comments, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on players from the 1950s. And please don't forget to subscribe. See y'all later.